All right, Psalm 119, let's call this one his whole brand, understanding that that word whole is going to come up more than once. And it's going to be mentioned early and relatively often in this longest chapter of the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, where there are a number of themes that we are going to look at because the chapter is way too long to summarize, for me at least, in 5 minutes. And so this is once again going to seem to be a bookend psalm, but it's not going to bookend in terms of literal themes that are going to repeat at the beginning and the end, but it is going to seem to have that whole concept of being whole or complete start off the way in which the psalmist describes the way in which he meditates on God's word with his whole heart. That second theme being meditation. But before we talk about the way that meditation fits into the middle themes throughout the psalm, he's going to end up talking about the way in which he hates every false way. Once again, communicating that whole concept of completeness. But before we talk about the wholes, let's talk about the middle and the way in which he seems to accomplish his goal of becoming complete by constantly meditating on God's word. And one of the things I like to mention when talking about Psalm 119 is it may not be a Psalm of David, but it sounds a whole lot like him, at least in the other Psalms that we have seen. And one of the interesting themes that we would be able to talk about if it is a Psalm of David is, once again, David was a soldier, started out as a shepherd and became a king. None of those things really have scholar as a part of his job title, but yet and still, if, once again, this is penned by David, he's helping us understand the degree to which a successful person of God, whatever your profession is, can be aided by constantly meditating on the wisdom that God has for your life in general. We have talked about it before. It's called work-life balance. What sense does it make, to put it biblically, if a person gains the whole world but loses their soul? Beyond the soul, what does it matter if all you're doing is working simply to come home to a place where you're struggling to find peace? And so part of what David seems to realize is not only the way that God's word can inform the balance that he would prefer to have between work and personal time, but it really informs both of them individually, allowing him to come together in probably a more peaceful whole. How do we know? Because we talked about the ways in which, in the past, David idealized cleansing the land of wickedness, but made exceptions in his own home when it became too tough for him, or it seemed too tough for him to discipline his own kid when he had committed a very serious sin against one of his own daughters. And so that destabilized the peace or the balance that he had finally found between being king and being the head of his household. And so likewise, at his best, if this is a Psalm of David, or even if it's not, these are words that David probably would have benefited from, that through constant meditation on God's word, he was going to develop the kind of wisdom that would allow him to develop the kind of balance in life that he would not be able to come up with on his own if you gave him 20 lifetimes, I'm sure. So beyond that, one of the themes that it also develops is his response to conflict, understanding that we talked about in the last Psalm, the way in which David was from time to time surrounded by enemies, disciplined by God, and rejected, likened into in some ways Christ, who was the stone that the builders rejected. One of the things that we're going to see over and over is this whole my enemies fill in the blank, but I. And David is going to say that he does not fall into the temptation to respond to his enemies according to their style of fighting. And so in life, there's a lot of wisdom in that, understanding that the temptation to respond to people who are attacking us can be to fight like they fight. But David realizes that if he fights like they fight, then we are falling into the trap of not only suffering at the hands of those who provoke us, but attracting the same kind of judgment that they are going to one day see from God as well. And so it's a lose-lose situation when we fight in the style of those who attack us in shady ways. And understanding that there are so many more themes that we could talk about in Psalm 119. At some point, we simply have to say this is one of those Psalms that it's best to probably study on your own time. And for now, God willing, these few themes can help you with something practical in a psalm that at first glance might seem somewhat overwhelming, which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward in him. God willing, being blessed by not only some of the things we might have mentioned in this short segment, but God willing, the things that you will ask him to help you see as you meditate on this psalm as well.